Good afternoon. It's the 20th of November. It's 3 o'clock and we're here in Glasgow. Part of this series that we've been doing this season, we've been looking at Scotland and the Scots, specifically Scots who have changed or influenced things in Scotland. Last week we focused on Howie Nicholsby, who was a contemporary kilt designer of 21st century kilts. This time we're going to take a little bit of a step back. We're just outside the MacIntosh at the Willow, so we're going to be looking a lot about Charles Rennie MacIntosh. It's been an honour to be invited here. We've got Oliver Braid, who's the creative learning manager here, and Oliver is going to take us on a tour. We're going to take a little tour of the tea rooms itself, and this is a must when you come to Glasgow. Put this on your agenda. If you haven't heard of Rennie MacIntosh, you're going to learn about him and his wife, Margaret MacDonald. So we're going to get a little bit more detail, but what we'd like to show you outside here, we're on Sauchiehall Street. Now, Sauchiehall Street means the Alley of the Willows in Old Scots here. At the moment, there's a bit of a construction going on, maybe bringing it back to its original, hopefully, bring it back to its original form here. It is a main thoroughfare in Glasgow, so Mike's taking a bit of the construction going on here on Sauchiehall Street. We'll also get a good picture of the building itself. It is an absolute gem of a place. And hopefully when we're finished here, you'll all be looking up Rennie MacIntosh. So this is here we've got Oliver. Oliver's the creative learning manager here, and Oliver's going to take us on a little tour, Macintosh specialist. We're going to focus on here, we're going to talk about his past, his present, his influence, his legacy, and things that influenced Charles Rennie MacIntosh throughout his career as well. It's a very short-lived career. He didn't live for very long, but his influence on Glasgow has been quite substantial. So good afternoon, Oliver.
Hey, thanks, Joe. Thanks for having me all. So welcome to Sauchiehall Street, and as Joe said, the Old Scots meaning of the word Sauchiehall is Alley of the Willows, which is where the tea rooms take their name from, and it's also a motif that MacIntosh uses throughout the building. So we could start perhaps by looking at the different levels of the building before we go inside. This building, this whole block, was built in 1865, and then in 1902 a lady called Kate Cranston bought the slice of the block that we're looking at right now. Kate Cranston by this time was a millionaire. She'd made her money by selling tea in tea houses. She basically invented tea houses, which are a Glasgow phenomenon, an alternative social space to the pub, which was very important for people at the end of the 1900s and the start of the 20th century. So Kate Cranston herself, she was Glasgow's first business woman, and normally when we talk about her we like to say that she was about 5 foot tall and about 5 foot wide. And I can actually, if Mike can come, I can show a photograph here of Kate Cranston just to the camera. The reason we say she was 5 foot wide is because throughout her whole life she wore one of these great big crinoline dresses. This dress was fashionable in about 1850, and this photograph was taken in about 1900. So she was already wearing clothes that were 50 years out of date by this time. Remember, she's a millionaire, she doesn't need to do this, she's doing it by choice. The Willow tea rooms was the 4th tea room that she built, and every day she would come to Glasgow and walk to all 4 of her tea rooms in this outfit, and people would say, who's this strange woman? And other people would say, that's Kate Cranston. So at the turn of the century there was a household expression in Glasgow. If something was unusual, people would say, it's quite Kate Cranston-ish.
So she was ahead of herself in terms of marketing her own stuff, using herself as a marketing tool.
Yeah, absolutely. So she marketed herself as looking like something from the past, and her buildings looked like something from the future. So she worked with different artists and designers, but by the time the 1900s turned, she was working almost exclusively with Charles Rennie MacIntosh. She bought this building in 1902, and she asked Charles Rennie MacIntosh to design it. He began the designs in February 1903, and he finished, the whole building was ready to open in October 1903. So 8 months from design to opening. The front of the building, the back of the building, 5 floors of the building, the waitresses' costumes, but not the crockery. And we'll talk about that as we go around. Before we go in, maybe we'll look at 3 different things that MacIntosh loves and that crops up a lot in his design and I think that that'll help us understand the building as we go around.
These are the motifs that reoccur throughout the whole building.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay.
So if you have a look first at the ground floor, you'll see that we've got this gridded window, this kind of black grid, which is reminiscent of a Japanese tea house. Japan and Glasgow had a cultural exchange from the 1870s onwards, which meant that we sent them Scottish objects and Japan sent us Japanese objects. And Glasgow stored them in this building here with a dome. This building was known as McClellan Galleries. It was the city's original museum, and it was also the second site of the city's art school. So Charles Rennie MacIntosh would later go on to design a very famous art school for Glasgow, which is further up the hill. But at this point, when Charles Rennie MacIntosh was studying, he studied in this building that was also the museum. So he was there and he was seeing this collection of Japanese objects starting to grow. So keep it in mind as we go around, Charles Rennie MacIntosh loves Japan and Japanismo. Now, as we move up to the second floor, if we look first at the sign, you'll be able to see these green teardrop shapes. These are leaves. They're one of the symbols of Glasgow. The sign takes in the tree, the birds at the top, the bells at the bottom, and the fish at the back. These are the four symbols of the city. But the tree is what we're looking at here, or the leaves on the tree are most important. Notice how they're flattened and simplified and given this black outline. This is a hallmark of an Art Nouveau treatment. Art Nouveau, in fact, is also inspired by Japanismo, this flattening out of the visual planes. And again, in the window, sorry Mike's just come down, but in the window, you'll see these silver bullet shapes at the top of stems of lead. These are buds of flowers. So Charles Rennie MacIntosh loves Japanismo, and he loves trees and flowers, particularly stylized trees and flowers.
If I could just butt in a minute, this is Mike here behind the camera, and I've got Magnus, my son, here. I'll maybe step into view at some point, and Magnus may take over some of the filming. But in terms of Art Nouveau, I think Glasgow and Scotland, they were trendsetters in Art Nouveau across the whole of the UK, and were very much connected with Europe, which this city of Glasgow was quite iconic in European art, wasn't it?
Yeah, Glasgow developed its own style at the end of the 1900s and throughout the early 1900s. At the end of the 1800s and throughout the early 1900s. It's generally just known as the Glasgow style. You'll see colours like purples, greens, pinks. This is very popular. Shapes like hearts, flowers, peacock tails. These kind of things get carved. One of the, I guess, hallmarks of the Glasgow style is often it uses domestic techniques like furniture design, fabric printing, stained glass, things like that. Perfect.
Excellent.
Lovely. And then right on the very top, this is hard to see from where we're positioned, but the top layer, you'll see that the windows to the left-hand side have a kind of curvature to them, which is a little bit like a tower or a turret on a Scottish castle. By the end of the 1800s, MacIntosh was giving a lecture in the city called Scots Baronial, which is an architectural style. It's a vernacular style of Scotland. Often castles are made in that way. So I think as we move through the building, keep in mind Japan, trees and flowers, Scottish castles. These things will keep us stable in the MacIntosh design.
Excellent.
Great.
So I think we should start to maybe move in, because the noise is getting a bit much here on the street. There is a lot of construction going on, but yep.
Off we go.
So we'll just take a little step in, but you're going to show us one of the motifs on the door as well.
Yeah, perfect. So we'll just have a real quick look at this door. We'll close it over and then we'll open it up again.
Yeah.
And we are live, so it is still being used as a tea room. So we have got people dining in here.
And so the motif here that we're looking at, that we're going to see a lot, is a kind of a T shape with bends on the end. So you can see that we've got the central bar of the T, then it goes across, and then it drops down. And this is a willow tree. It's the form of a willow tree. So again, Sauchiehall Street, Alley of the Willows. This is the Willow Tea Rooms, or the original Willow Tea Rooms building. Now we trade under the name MacIntosh at the Willow.
Excellent.
Okay.
This is great. This is great, Oliver. Thank you so much for this. Every day's a school day.
Oops.
So, in through here, 120 years ago, this is the entrance that you would have come into. And it's worth paying attention to the designs in this hallway. You'll see behind me, we've got this white wooden screen with stained glass inserts. This is very similar to the screen that was also at Ingram Street, the tea rooms that MacIntosh had helped redesign 2 years prior to this building. So he's familiar with this type of design. In the glass, you'll be able to see that these canes gather thickly on one side to form the trunk of a tree, and then they split out into the branches of a tree. The leaves are these squares here, and then hanging down these white cabochons, or these opal cabochons, are the catkins of the willow. So this screen has willow trees on it. Now if we flip onto the other side, we'll look at some plaster panels. These are much harder to see. They're much more ambiguous, the form of them. You'll notice the green lines and the green fingerprint dots. This is mistletoe. And so we know that, again, what we're looking at here are willow trees.
And mistletoe grows on the willow tree.
Perfect.
And the mistletoe does appear quite a lot in other art movements in here. So it's part of the spiritualism that was going on as part of the Glasgow boys themselves. It's all part of a movement, so the mistletoe is relevant.
Could just interrupt and mention the great painting in Kelvin Cove Art Gallery, which is bringing in the mistletoe by Hornell and Henry, and of course their admiration and connection with pagan ritual as well.
Great, so we're going to move into another tea room, but the reason I pointed out willow trees on this side, willow trees on this side, we are in a hall of willows. To get into the tea rooms, MacIntosh makes people walk through a hall of willows, which is, again, the name of Sauchiehall Street. So clever design.
Yeah.
So follow us through into the ground floor saloons. We'll go into the front saloon first and gather by the fireplace. Perfect. So welcome to the ground floor saloon. We can see from inside here we've got this big window, the Japanismo inspired window that we looked at outside, and you'll see that the majority of the wall in here is white. Lots of white walls. Nowadays, very commonplace. 120 years ago, a little bit more unusual. When we lit our spaces with gas or oil, when they burnt, they would leave dark marks on the walls, grease or smoke. And so the Victorians or earlier people tended to have these very dark wallpapers, greens and burgundies. With this new electric light that we can see up in this structure, MacIntosh is able to experiment with a white wall. It has the other benefit of bouncing the light around, so it keeps the space nice and bright. Normally we refer to this room as being like a meadow. We tend to think of MacIntosh designs, or particularly buildings, as laid out a bit like forests, and so this space is on the edge of the forest. As we move further back, we're going to get into a darker, lower space.
So he's also been influenced by the new technologies of the period as well. So he's bringing in art and technology. I have to look at Glasgow in that term as well, because Glasgow was a booming city.
Yes.
We're talking about a city that was the second city of the empire. There was conspicuous spending going on. There were very rich people here. Get it in terms, it was like the Belle Epoque in France. We're looking at the Gilded Age in the States. And here we're looking at Glasgow as a powerhouse.
The workshop of the world, I think it liked to call itself. Yeah. So we produced all kinds of soap and rope and ships and trains, lots of different types of things. So there was lots of money coming into the city. What had made Sauchiehall Street that we're on, Glasgow's most fashionable street, was the introduction of department stores, which again come with money and come with expendable wealth. So we started to get department stores all along this street, and people who would come to their department stores when they needed to come for somewhere to eat or drink afterwards, we were very well placed for them to come to. In this room, kind of in contrast to the white walls, we've got these black painted floorboards and black painted furniture. Often when you see recreation MacIntosh furniture, you can tell it's recreation because people have painted it a solid black. Whereas with normal MacIntosh furniture, you can actually normally see the wood grain. There's normally a bit of brown showing through on the wood. And there's a suggestion in this room, we're in this bright meadow, with the furniture the same colour as the floors. It's as if the furniture is growing up out of the floors like little saplings. And then right in the middle of the room, we've got this big, strange structure here. MacIntosh didn't write that much about his own work, and so we usually have to look to other thinkers or theorists about what this is supposed to be. Thomas Howarth, who wrote, I think, the first Mackintosh PhD, it was published in 1949, he described this structure as a veritable baldacchino. It's quite wordy.
Yeah.
A baldacchino is the canopy that goes over the throne of a king or a queen or a pope, and it seems that Howard's inference is that Kate Cranston, the owner of these tea rooms, was such a good patron to Mackintosh that he gives her a throne in this, her crown jewel of tea rooms.
Oh, excellent.
But other readings, there's two that I like. One suggests that this central pillar is again the trunk of a tree, and these arms coming off their branches. But my favourite is from Alison Brown, who's the curator for Mackintosh at Glasgow Museums. And she says that actually this is the roots of a tree growing up into the ceiling. You see these concentric rings in the middle? Mackintosh has used that before to indicate the rings of a tree. And when we go upstairs, directly above those tree rings, we're going to find a tree blossoming in the room above.
So we continued up through the 3 floors. The motif that gets carried through.
Yeah, this
So
is quite common with
he's
Mackintosh.
space. He's using the space to take his creations through the whole structure of the building.
Yeah, perfect. And to take the actual user of the building on a sort of journey. Lastly, I'll just point out this kind of central glass globe. At the minute, it's filled with festive ornamentation, but normally it has flowers in it. When Kate Cranston ran this building as a tea room from 1903 to 1919, these flowers were fresh every week. They were brought to town by a boy in a green cart with a donkey called Penelope, because Kate Cranston, as a really savvy businesswoman, owned a great big house in Nits Hill where she grew flowers and fruit and vegetables so that she could supply her own restaurants. Later, she also owned a bakery and a laundrette, so she became totally self-sufficient so that she could spend her money on commissioning Mackintosh.
I mean, she was a savvy woman, let's face it. And again, at the time, we're talking about this is a place where women would come in general for tea. And we're going to talk a little bit later about the temperance movement, because that was a big influence on Kate Cranston herself.
Yeah, absolutely. So Kate Cranston came from a background of hoteliers. Her family owned hotels in Edinburgh, and she grew up in a hotel that her father owned in George Square in the centre of Glasgow. She had brothers and sisters who also went into kind of hospitality movements, including one brother, Stuart, who met a man who was staying at the family hotel who was a tea merchant, introduced him to the tea trade. Stuart opened the first tea retailing business in Glasgow. And in that business, he had a table where he would serve samples to customers. That became very popular. Kate Cranston saw that, and with investment from her uncle Robert Cranston in Edinburgh, opened her first tea room, Glasgow's first tea room.
Yeah, just on that subject, in terms of tea, it must have been quite expensive, leaf tea going back to these days. Is that the case? Was it just a certain set of quite wealthy people who would be able to do that, to buy it?
What I suppose it's a combination of, there was a social change that the price of tea dropped greatly. It had been very highly taxed, and that's why sometimes you see what we would know as tea caddies with locks on them. So there was a period where tea was locked away because it was a precious commodity. Then we went through a period where it became much more accessible. So Glasgow and lots of other places also had tea gardens where you could go out and maybe be surrounded by some animals and drink some tea. There's also kind of stories about like people with less means or less funds would dry out old tea leaves and reuse that. But pretty soon it really became a national drink. And by this time, to come to this tea room, if you were in the ground floor spaces, it was actually very cheap. And when we go into the back saloon, I'll talk a little bit about that kind of pricing of tea.
So the different classes as well.
Yeah, this was a general space. The rooms that we're in are a general space, but as we work our way up the building, things are going to get a little bit more exclusive. Kate Cranston did commission Mackintosh one last time in this space. In 1917, they ripped out this fireplace to make a doorway that went into a basement space. It's much later MacIntosh. It feels much more Art Deco than Art Nouveau. It wasn't photographed, so we only have a drawing of it. It was called the Dugout, and it's a space for men who'd come out of the war to come and drink coffee and smoke cigarettes. I'm going to try and hold that up so that Magnus can just capture it on camera. I don't know how well that's going to show up in the light because it's a very dark image, but you can see we've got this yellow settle, this blue design with red poppies. It's very primary colours, it's very angular. It's not the same as this kind of much softer, earlier Art Nouveau.
So this is more feminine, I think.
Well, it's interesting that you say that because as we go up through the space, we will talk about MacIntosh's ideas of like, what is a feminine design? What is a masculine design? They were a bit obsessed with it.
Yeah.
Perfect. So if we're in the meadow right now, nice and bright, as we go further back, we're going to go under the canopy of trees. So let's walk there and just be careful of this stair. So in the back saloon, the ceiling becomes very low and it has these beams, almost like the branches of trees. Perfect. And I spend a lot of time in this space talking, so I know that it's not just the light that changes, it's also the sound quality. One of the things that changes the sound, it's not just the low ceiling, but it's that the wall is covered in fabric, so that absorbs the sound. And if you look, I don't know if the camera can capture, but there are shadows. My shadows are showing up on the walls. These walls, again, are inspired by Japanese tea houses, the kind of shoji or paper walls that you would see. And again, there's this suggestion that the shadows that are showing up on this side could actually be people standing on the other side of the space. So even though we're in a small enclosed space, there's this architectural game that there are these kind of more imaginary spaces on the other side. And all of that is made possible, again, with this new electric light. So 120 years ago when we first opened, only about 2% of Glasgow had electric light. So tea rooms weren't just places that you come for tea or coffee. As we said before, you also come to see new design, new technology, and new art. They were like aesthetic experiences.
And it was revolutionary in its time as well.
Yeah, this was all stuff that, so the concrete, the white concrete on the front of the building, that was a new material. Electric light, relatively new material. And then these stencils here, they are a mix of aluminium, and aluminium we're going to see used in another space. And again, that was a brand new material. At the turn of the 20th century, aluminium was more expensive than gold. So you can see that Cranston really invested in MacIntosh.
Let's take a little walk over to these seats.
It's very clever because you can think of a tendency for it to be very dark, and they're using reflective materials, to bring more light into it too. But I'm quite interested in terms of the social life at the time of women being able to have chats with a bit of privacy as well, and they would feel this is a nice safe space to do that also. So the feminine side is...
as we go upstairs, we're going to see the space where women were welcomed, or a certain class of women were welcomed. This backspace was generally used more for people to have a meal.
Right,
Whereas
okay.
the front, people would have been having tea. And as I said before, it's based on the white dining room in Ingram Street. There would have been women in that space as well, but this is more your kind of dinner, dining type space, having a cosy chat. On the walls, we've got these stencils which are designed by Margaret MacDonald, Charles Rennie MacIntosh's wife and collaborative partner. The early MacIntosh academics were all men, of course, and so they really downplayed Margaret's role, with some people saying that everything that was genius was MacIntosh and everything that looked like Art Nouveau bric-a-brac was Margaret. Not true. In the 1980s, there was a rediscovery of the couple's letters between each other, and there was a general consensus realization that actually they pretty much worked collaboratively on everything. When they designed the tea rooms, they actually only lived one street away around the corner, so they could be coming all the time. For the first 6 months that the tea room opened, MacIntosh came every single morning to check that it was being done how he liked, until the staff had to ask Miss Cranston to ask him to stop coming in.
I love that.
We might hear a bit more about MacIntosh's obsessiveness as we go around.
So can we take a wee bit more into the detail of this here? Because there's a lot of the stuff that you miss when you just walk past it. It's the intricacies of the pattern here. And we're saying this is more, you're looking at because people recognise the MacIntosh rose here, but you also recognise the colours. You already mentioned the pinks and the greens, which are quite in there. But we've also got the female form here as well. Can you talk a wee bit more about that?
Yeah, so the mixture of females and foliage is also going to recur through this building. It has a kind of romantic element to it, right? Upstairs we're going to see particularly some influence of poetry and some of the poets that Margaret really liked. Some people, when they look at this face, will again liken it to a kind of Japanese kabuki mask as well. So we've got this kind of Japanismo influence coming in, and then we've got this long line. You'll notice that she doesn't have a body that is particularly pointed out. This is really popular in Glasgow style, and it's mostly influenced by the work, I think, of Aubrey Beardsley, who was an English designer who only lived until he was about 26 years old. But in the small time that he was around, he made a big impact. And he would often use these kind of lines to represent females' bodies or characters' bodies.
Another thing about Beardsley is his monochromatic imagery, where there's a lot of black and white, isn't there, too, which you can see the influence here of that also,
It's been said to me before that MacIntosh is just a Beardsley fanboy. I'll leave that. But yeah, so we see this line which comes down, could be her hairline, but then also kind of becomes quite decorative, so it could be the kind of outline of a dress.
We've also got the intricate detail. I mean, it's his obsession with detail everywhere you go. I mean, I was even looking at the lampshades up here as well. So he goes into everything.
Yeah. So on the lampshades, particularly the ones that are just over here, what's unusual about them is that normally you would think somebody who's going to put something so high up and hidden in a beam, they're not going to bother making that much of a fuss about them, right? But actually, again, MacIntosh has inserted this kind of pink lozenge shape. Some people see it as a peacock's tail, but we can also think of it as the shape of a willow leaf. And I think that is better to think about in this space.
I mean, so every time you look around, you're picking up another detail that MacIntosh, and you can see why they kind of hacked off with his obsession.
Yeah.
But it's his creation.
I mean, he was very patron. Other commissions didn't go so well. The building that he made after this ended up going a bit disastrously wrong. There's a misconception, really, and we touched on it a little bit before, that to come to these tea rooms you had to be rich or posh, but actually the rooms that we've seen so far and the room that we're going to see next were all spaces that anybody could come to. 120 years ago, if you came here, a cup of tea would cost you the equivalent in today's money of about 65 pence. So it's super cheap, super cheap. People could come here, and when they came here, they would be sat at a table, and they would ring the bell, like this, and a waitress would come to serve them. When the waitress had the order, she would take that order to a lady sitting in a chair just down here that we should go and look at now.
Yeah.
So this is quite a famous chair. It's colloquially known as the Willow chair, and that's because it has a willow tree again in the back of it. So you can see that we have trunk of the tree, the branches coming out, and then the leaves of the willow dripping down. It also has this lovely curve to it which just helps divide the front saloon and the back saloon. The person sitting here was in charge of getting the order to the kitchen. 120 years ago, there was a little glass tube just near this chair. The lady who sat here would have had a selection of coloured glass balls. She turned the order into a colour code, dropped it down the tube, and that went into the kitchen, which was in the basement and is still in the basement today. And that is how we got orders through before we had internal phones or tills, things like this. This lady, we think, was also in charge of looking after the money, and she would have sat on it and kept it just under here.
Hilarious. Sounds like a money commode.
Yes, money commode, perfect. Really good metaphor for money in general. And this chair has been in quite a lot of films. You might have seen it. It's actually in the background of 9.5 Weeks, we just learned recently. It's in Inception. There's a version of it in Star Trek. MacIntosh chairs in general, you will quite often see them in things like Doctor Who or the Addams Family, wherever they want to create a spooky or kind of surreal, otherworldly atmosphere.
Speaking about that,
Speaking of the
Oliver,
spook.
I must talk about that, the Spook School, because they were so ahead of their time that people had never seen anything like the work that these famous four, that was Charles Rennie MacIntosh and Margaret MacDonald and Frances MacDonald and her husband, who were all artists. Herbert McNair, of course, was an architect, and they were tagged as being the Spook School. And you were saying that Kate Cranston probably connected with that.
Yeah, we think that obviously Kate Cranston's love of an eccentric image and understanding the value of marketing and having this brand that stood out probably attracted her to that. We looked earlier before we started this video at a watercolour that MacIntosh made, which you can Google, called Part Seen, Imagined Part. MacIntosh exhibited that in London in 1896. There was quite a fuss made about it, how weird it was, and then in 1897, lo and behold, Kate Cranston commissions MacIntosh to do the murals in her tea room on Buchanan Street.
Excellent. So we're looking at, again, looking at the period, we're coming out of the dark Victorian period. I was imagining it was black bombazine, heavy furniture, and we're coming into this revolutionary, the bohemian style, especially of these four, who marketing themselves through their own behaviours, through their own associations. And so Miss Cranston sees this and goes like, I want some of that.
Yeah, absolutely. These people were starting to make waves, and there was a general movement, right? There was lots. So we talk about the four a lot as kind of key figures in that, but actually there's maybe 30 to 70 artists working in the city developing this style that will come to be known as the Glasgow style. And even George Walton, who was MacIntosh's predecessor, Kate Cranston used to work with George Walton a lot to do her designs. He really contributed. You can see very similar things like hearts, stained glass, printed fabric, always these domestic arts, which is perfect also for a tea room, because tea at the time was thought of really as being part of the domestic sphere. So we did have dining halls earlier on in the Victorian period, but they normally had these long refectory tables and chairs where lots of people would be seated. You'll notice that in these new tea rooms we have these kind of smaller groupings, tables with maybe 4 chairs. This is much more like sitting at home, sitting in a domestic space, albeit quite an unusual heightened one. Oh, we dropped a chair. But look how sturdy that MacIntosh furniture is. Perfect. Excellent. Okay,
With a
so
live feed here, folks.
Yeah, we are live.
Not edited.
if we're ready, we're going to take the stairs to go up to the mezzanine space.
Perfect.
Perfect.
Are you ready, Magnus? You're going to
Yeah.
follow us? Be careful of the step here, buddy. Oh, sorry. Although this is fantastic, again, thank you so much for this. It's the depth of knowledge and the whole being invited here. It means so much to us, and I'm sure it means a lot to our audience as well. Hopefully you're learning a lot more about the contribution that Glasgow was making, not only to the arts, but also the influences that were influenced Rennie MacIntosh as well.
Yes. So
Oh, here we
our
are.
building was opened by the king, or he was the prince at that time, and Queen Consort Camilla, or whatever she was called at the time. A little bit actually. We didn't really talk about the history of this building. Kate Cranston ran it until 1919 as a tea room, and then it was sold to a man called John Smith, who was a famous restaurateur in the city. The first thing that he did when he bought the building with all of its contents was take all of the MacIntosh furniture out, and he took it to his more popular restaurant called the Grosvenor, which is still in Glasgow but is down by the train station. So we lost the furniture. Then, one of the many department stores that we talked about on Sauchiehall Street, a department store called Daly's Department Store, they took over this entire building, and they were here until the late 1970s, almost 50 years. So they were actually the longest tenant a lot of the stuff, the MacIntosh stuff that was left, they covered up. Sometimes it got taken away, so we lost some stuff there, but the stuff that they covered up, when we came into the building, we were able to take that away, and a lot of it was still in perfect condition. So what we're looking at today is a mixture of original, recreation, and restoration. When the department store moved out, it became a jeweller's, again, for about 30 years, and then the building became empty. By that time, it was looking a bit sad. The concrete on the front was very dirty. No one knew what was going to happen to the building. People were worried that if it was sold to a private individual, what was left of the MacIntosh stuff would be broken up and sold to Russian oligarchs or other people, and we would never see it again. So instead what happened was a lady called Celia Sinclair, who'd made a lot of money in property, came and she purchased the entire building. She's very passionate about MacIntosh. She bought this building and she got a big grant from the National Lottery Heritage Fund, and for 4 years, from 2014 to 2018, she worked with artists and designers and artisans and academics to return this building to look exactly how it looked in 1903, using the same techniques and the same materials. Perfect. So we're going to go up the stairs. This is the original staircase from 120 years ago. The majority of the wood and the enamelled glass is original. And the same with the glass on this side of the stairs. Perfect. So welcome to the mezzanine. If the front saloon was a meadow and under the trees, now we're on top of the trees. It's nearly dusk in Glasgow, so it's starting to get a bit darker, but normally this is the brightest space. And Magnus, if you pan round, we'll be able to see that there are 8 columns going around the mezzanine space. Normally columns would be holding some weight, but these, you can possibly see that, again, we've got this T-form, so the columns go up, they have a board at the top that comes out like the branches, and the lights coming down just like the leaves. So what MacIntosh has created, which he's done in other spaces before, is a clearing in the forest. We've got this gap in the forest. Then wrapping around the whole room, if Magnus, if you pan the purple walls now, or this way, hello. So we will see that MacIntosh has put this purple stenciling, and similar to that Japanismo type window at the front, and we've got these roses going around the top. This is a different take on the Glasgow rose, but it's still this kind of cabbage rose.
No, you're good.
So, talked about MacIntosh being controlling or a bit neurotic. In this space, he's done something that means even if we take all the tables out, we'll still know chairs are designed at the height to meet the stenciling. So we position it just like this, and you can see that this rose trellis that goes up is kind of completed by the addition of the chair. So this T-form of the tree. The last thing that we should talk about in this room is the crockery. I'm going to hold some up to the camera. Kate Cranston said to MacIntosh, design everything for me apart from the crockery. The crockery, she had the same in all 4 of her tea rooms. You might recognise it. It's quite a famous design. It's known as the Willow pattern. The Willow pattern tells the story, apparently, of a kind of Chinese legend where a princess and her poor partner, her poor boyfriend, are chased by the Mandarin across a bridge on the pain of death, and they escape and are turned into 2 birds and fly away. But it's not an ancient Chinese legend at all. It was made up by Victorian British people to sell China. But it worked really, really well. This was an extremely popular design. People got it for weddings, people had it in their houses. And we think that Kate Cranston insisted on having it in all of her tea rooms, because even if people came to this space and they were totally overwhelmed by these new technological inventions, the electronic light, the concrete, the aluminium, all these bright designs, as soon as they sat down, they at least had something that they were familiar with and that was comfortable and, again, domestic.
Continuity. Her dressed in her old mid-Victorian dress and the modern as well, so it's giving that continuity as well.
Yeah, perfect. So this is the last of the rooms that anyone could come into. But there are 2 more rooms that we're going to go into. The next room that we're going to see is the most exquisite room. It's probably the most exquisite MacIntosh room that I've seen in any of the spaces. So we're going to go up the stairs now into what is known as the Salon Deluxe.
This is a real treat to get to see this.
So we'll go this way.
As we're moving, I embrace the Glasgow style in the houses and homes, and even in the stained glass in some of the residential areas, but also through friends I know in Glasgow. They're very still connected with all of this. So it's almost like it's always been reinvented and still with us much today in terms of taste.
Even when you say that, Mike, I was just thinking, on my street, my next door neighbour has a MacIntosh design on their front door, and when I moved in, when I bought the house, the predecessor had left me a set of MacIntosh design champagne flutes.
Yep.
So it is, it's a kind of cultural currency in the city.
And Glasgow really owns it as its own, the Glasgow style.
So, as we just walked up the stairwell, you'll see that the walls are mostly painted grey, but as we come into here, you're going to see some silvery paint. Keep in mind that 120 years ago, all of the stairwell was painted with that silvery paint, so we've got much more of a glow, a reflecting of the light.
And maybe Magnus can pick up the silver, the difference between the black, moving into the room.
Perfect.
Beautiful doors.
Yeah, this is a nice shot. So, yeah, perfect. Magnus has got it. So, let's come in to the poshest room in the whole building.
Oh, wonderful.
might just-
Amazing. Yeah.
Pan around for a minute,
Yeah.
maybe, just to let people take this in. So, 120 years ago, if you'd have come here into the Salon Deluxe, you had to be two things. One, you had to be rich. Entrance to the salon, some sources suggest, cost an extra £10. So if you consider that tea was 65 pence, £10 is a big increase. So you had to be rich. The other thing that you had to be is a woman. This is the ladies' salon. In the Victorian period, life changed for women. Previously, women hadn't been allowed to go out on the street without a chaperone, without a male chaperone. But in Glasgow, things changed. As we got department stores, we started to say, well, if you're going to go out and buy hats and coats and gloves and spend lots of money, we will allow women to go out. Very liberating. But these women still had two problems. When they were out in the town, there was nowhere for them to go to the toilet, and there was nowhere for them to eat or drink. Edwardian Glasgow did have pubs with ladies' rooms, but the type of women that came here, that would have been very shameful. This is for rich, young women. Probably their parents made money during the Industrial Revolution and Glasgow's expansion, and now they're here spending cash. And Kate Cranston wanted these women to feel special in this space. As a woman herself, and Glasgow's first businesswoman, Kate Cranston saw that there was this gap to have ladies' salons. She wasn't the first person to have a ladies' room, we should say that, but she's among a new generation of people that are providing ladies' spaces. And she asked Charles Rennie MacIntosh and his wife, Margaret MacDonald, to design this space as a fairy tale fantasy.
And everything about it is fairy tale. I mean, just looking at the doors itself, you mentioned already the colours. So we've got the green, we've got the pink, we've got the purples, we've got the stylised MacIntosh designs that you see. I mean, you already mentioned that you've got champagne flutes. And if you go to the West End of Glasgow, you see a lot of people have got the windows with these stained glass in it as well. So you've got all of the motifs coming out here with the rose as well.
Yeah. So Kate Cranston, she asked them to make, and we'll maybe come this way round, is they put in this great big bay window. This wasn't here originally, they carved it out. Remember, everything we're looking at was drawn and done in 8 months, ready to go. Big window. The big window lets in lots of lovely light, which bounces off these mirrors that wrap all the way around the room. These are the original mirrors. They've lasted 120 years, with the exception of a couple of panes. And if we get a bit closer to them, or just have a little look at them, we'll see they're not flat to the wall. They're ever so slightly angled, so that they ripple around the space like a body of water, like a big river. Charles Rennie MacIntosh and his wife, Margaret MacDonald, had some funny ideas, and they believed that water was a feminine element and should therefore be included in the design of spaces for women. Now, Magnus, I'm not sure if you can get this, but just below the mirrors, below this rippling water, we've also got these silver walls with very small jewels or beads embroidered into the walls. I've never seen this in any other MacIntosh building.
See the little beads here? There you go, Magnus.
Perfect.
And you can see the shape of the mirrors. As you said, they're not flat against the wall. Slightly, as you said, the rippling effect here. And that would change the light as well.
Yeah, it bounces the light around the room. And then the beads are as if the water is dribbling down the walls. So the light bounces up, and it bounces up into these two big chandeliers.
And we can get a photo of these chandeliers here, Magnus.
Perfect. So Magnus, just coming up here, just to see where my finger is. That's great. So having a look at the chandeliers, the first thing you'll probably notice about them is they've got lots of bubbles in them. We know that MacIntosh wanted that from his workbooks. Normally when you blow glass, having bubbles in it is a sign of bad glass blowing.
Yeah. No, excellent.
No, sorry, I thought you had... So the bubbles function in a couple of ways. One, you'll notice that they pick up on the light so that shoots the light off again, giving it that kind of twinkly fairy tale feeling. But also lots of people notice how it looks like a big splash of water. It's got this kind of vitality of water. The two things people say a lot about the chandeliers is they either look like big splashes of water, or they remind them of the hanging of willow trees. So this willowy form.
You could almost see it like if there was a wind, it would flow like a willow tree.
Perfect, really nice to think about that. So water and willows are two of the really important design features of this room, and it's carried on in this gesso panel over here that was designed by Margaret MacDonald. So, just while Magnus comes over, gesso was taught at the art school in Glasgow in the late 1800s. Normally it's used by artists to smooth out their canvases. It's a mixture of plaster or French chalk and rabbit skin glue. So it's viscous, it's gelatinous. What Margaret MacDonald invented, and this is a very domestic invention as well, was putting gesso into a piping bag and to pipe out, to ice the image onto the canvas, a bit like you would ice a cake. So it's kind of three-dimensional. This panel is called O Ye, All Ye Who Walk Through Willow Wood, which is a title of a poem by Dante Rossetti. And in the poem, a poet, who is a man, walks through a forest of willow trees, and ghostly women. He comes across a pool of water, which is this green shape here, so water again, and when he looks into the water, he sees the spirit of his dead lover. He reaches out to touch her, and as he does, the ripples form over the water. Margaret's made them in the shape of roses, and she disappears. I always think the most remarkable thing about this is that we're in a women's room. Women are getting new freedoms, and the main artwork is the picture of a dead woman. So, why is that? What does that mean? For Edwardians and Victorians, willow trees were symbols of sadness, of mourning, and they believed that ghosts lived in willow trees.
And you can just see the picture of the dead woman here and her attendants. Beautiful.
Yes.
I mean, to get the detail in that one.
There are two big gesso panels in the Kelvin Globe Art Gallery also. We've one by Charles Rennie MacIntosh and one by Margaret MacDonald also. But I'm just looking at this, and the intricacy of this here is totally amazing. Just the way this is all represented in very linear way, which is typically Art Nouveau style. Yeah.
Also, I think while we're on close-up, I'd just point out this eye floating in the middle with tears coming down. This eye shape you also see in other works by the MacDonald sisters, both Margaret and Frances. And underneath this eye, we've got teardrops. Some people mention that we've got these teardrops and that the droplets that we saw earlier on the wall could also be like teardrops. So why dead women? Why ghosts? Why spirits? MacIntosh and Margaret MacDonald were functioning at a time where people were very interested in the other worlds, the other planes. Spiritualism was at its zenith in Glasgow as well as in other places. We had a psychic in this space recently, and she pointed out that each of these walls in this room have a portal, a door on one side, a window on the other, and then these frames, these big frames on both sides. And apparently this is the same layout as Aleister Crowley's flat in London. It was perfect for casting spells and doing magical work. We don't know if the MacIntoshes themselves did any kind of actual paganistic practices, but they are working parallel to, as Mike mentioned earlier, the Celtic revival, particularly that image of bringing in the mistletoe, focusing on images of druids. And of course, we know that druids worshipped willow trees and used sacred groves or nematons. And there's some suggestion that this room itself functions as one of those sacred groves. Downstairs, I mentioned the roots growing up into the ceiling and turning into a blossoming tree. That tree is in this stained glass door just over there.
You're mentioning Aleister Crowley. He was termed the wickedest man in the world at one point, and some say that J.K. Rowling used his story as an idea for Voldemort, and we do touch on him on our tours going up towards Loch Ness, where he had a home up there.
Yes, Boleskine House, and you know Boleskine House, slightly off point, that also had a portal on all five sides. That's why he chose Boleskine House to cast the Abramelin.
Well,
And you've got the four portals and the four elements of earth, wind, fire, etc.
So the door, lastly, I'll just show it. We've got, this is the willow tree that I mentioned blossoming downstairs. The silver at the centre is the trunk. The branches come out on either side. And this time, sometimes people see these as roses, but because they're green, we actually normally say, oh, they're mistletoe again. So we've got mistletoe in this willow structure. Some people also look at these doors and see a kimono. Remember, MacIntosh loves Japanismo. Interesting fact about women in the Victorian times. Usually they would have to wear very restrictive clothing. We know a corset, a bustle, a crinoline, hats and gloves. If they had a tea party in their own home, and there was no more than 6 of them, and they were all women, they were allowed, they were allowed to wear what was known as a tea gown, which was a loose kimono fitting type outfit. And so my personal take is that part of this is also a reference to this being this kind of intimate, domestic space that women can relax.
Liberated.
This kind of tea gown space. Yeah, liberated. And that is a really interesting point about the use of this space and some of the colours. Sometimes when people see these colours, they say purple, green and white. MacIntosh is referencing the suffragettes. This building opened in 1903. The suffragettes, it seems, didn't actually choose their colours until about 1906 to 1908. So what are these colour schemes doing? We've already touched that they're kind of popular in the Glasgow style already. But again, Alison Brown, who we mentioned downstairs, curator for MacIntosh at Glasgow Museums, she did a bit of research and she found that all of these colours, the purple, the pink, the green, the white, the silver of the chairs, these are all colours that can be found in the 400 to 500 different willow tree species. So the design, not only the motifs of willow trees, but even the colour scheme for the entire building. And that's because MacIntosh believed in this idea of the Gesamtkunstwerk, right? The total artwork, so that everything in it contributes to this kind of whole environment.
I think also what's interesting is the vaulted ceiling in here, which makes me think of MacIntosh's fascination with Scottish baronial architecture and castellated buildings too, because it makes me think of an old castle in a way,
Yeah,
like a vaulting.
hall.
Yeah.
Yeah, this ceiling's very interesting as well because if you come in here to have a gossip and you're sat on one side of the room, you have to be very careful because the person sitting on the other side of the room, the sound carries and they can hear you. So you can imagine that over the years there might have been some scenes in here.
Oh, yeah.
We do know, however, that tea rooms were important to the suffrage movement, and so we do expect the suffragettes would have come in here at some point. As a woman-led business, and tea rooms often were, and as mostly women being in the building working, we think suffragettes came in here to politically organise. So the tea rooms did in some way contribute to women's liberation. We've got the rich young women that came in here, we've got the potential for suffragettes, and we've got one last type of person that would have come in here, the waitress. Kate Cranston, as an employer, had that kind of Victorian philanthropic interest about her. So she would often employ women that she thought had come from difficult circumstances, who were possibly single parent families or orphans, or who'd come from single parent families. She would train these women up. She would have their outfit, their waitress's outfit was handmade for them in Paris and designed by Rennie MacIntosh, again, to be part of the total artwork. And some of these women would then be trained up by Kate Cranston in how to run their own business, which led to a proliferation of more tea rooms in Glasgow.
So you're looking at an early social enterprise.
Yeah, very much so. And that is how we function now. MacIntosh at the Willow is a social enterprise. And similarly to Kate Cranston, a lot of the people who work in this building, they've come to us through the Prince's Trust or Developing Young Workforce or Action for Children. So getting people into the workplace for the first time.
So let's talk about what you're doing here in 2023 in Glasgow, still working as a social enterprise.
Yes, so when Celia set the space up, she definitely, I think, took on a lot of Kate Cranston's ideas of it being social, bringing people into the space, and also educating or helping people to better themselves. So as the creative learning manager, my role is normally to work with schools, colleges, universities, employment schemes, and community groups of all different varieties. And every week, several times a week, we bring lots of different groups in here. We run workshops, we also run work experience and work placements, and we also have international exchanges with Erasmus students. So a lot of our staff are learning whilst working. Yeah, really, really exciting.
So it's continuing on through the influences of Cranston herself. It's still coming through to the 21st century.
And I guess our mission is to share this legacy, not just of Kate Cranston and not just of MacIntosh, but the two together, this kind of perfect mixture of art and philanthropy, using art as a way to be philanthropic.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I just wanted, you talked about the total art. I just wanted to pull out a few details and maybe we can get Magnus to focus in as well, is the actual chairs themselves. I mean, stunning. If we can just get a focus on that.
So this chair was designed by MacIntosh for the Salon Deluxe. You can see it's got this kind of silvery patina, but again, this is aluminium. So this chair, when it's first made, it is in a light wood, and then it's painted with one layer of white paint, one layer of gold leaf, and 7 layers of aluminium. So much so that some reports say that these chairs, when they were first made 120 years ago, cost £12,000 each. It's like the price of a cheap car or something. But we've got 8 of them.
Absolutely fantastic. But also we look at the coat stands as well. So, I mean, it's the detail that MacIntosh went into every single thing.
Yeah.
And you can see where he was obsessive, because even the coat stands have got the MacIntosh design here as well. If you can bring it a wee bit closer here, Magnus. Stunning. I mean, everything about it is stunning.
So again, this kind of Japanismo type gridding, but also possibly a kind of tree form, right? We have some small hooks coming up at the top and then a kind of umbrella stand at the bottom, reminding us that we're in Glasgow and in general we need to have our umbrellas with us.
I know, I love the way that they actually got the mirrors to reflect the water. You don't have to go too far in Glasgow to get water.
No, absolutely. And what I always think is interesting is that a lot of the women who would have come here, these rich young women, of course, their families would have made money in something connected to water.
To the river.
Shipping and docking and things like that.
The river plays a big role here in Glasgow.
Yeah. So we've talked quite a lot about women's history and the lives of women. There has to come a point where we talk about the lives of men.
Yeah.
And we would do that by going up to the next floor.
We're getting lots of comments about how great this is and what a great guide you are.
Thanks.
And lots of appreciative comments.
Well, when you come to Glasgow, come and see Oliver.
Yeah, you can come and book in a tour with me. Come and do a workshop. So yeah, I guess that is part of what we do now. You'll find if you do come here as a tourist, one of our taglines is that we're more than just a tea room. So you can come here for tea. You can come and do workshops with me. We run family workshops and adult art workshops. You can rent out corporate spaces. You can visit. We've got a 2-story museum. We've got a retail centre. So really, you could spend the best part of a day here. I mean, you could come for tea twice.
Yeah. And I will say, I did actually bring a tour here from the Netherlands. This was earlier, it was last year. And the feedback from them was they were really interested. They didn't know much about MacIntosh. They were actually learning English, and they were doing it through art. And so the guide brought them over. She had been to Glasgow a couple of times, but she wanted to focus in on MacIntosh. And so I called up. We got a tour organised, and by the end of it, they were just loving it. They were loving it. I mean, I think they spent a little fortune in your retail centre as well.
Nice. Yeah, a lot of the stuff that we sell in the retail centre as well is from very local makers. A lot of it is exclusive to us, so it's also a great place to come and pick something up that is kind of MacIntosh, Glasgow, and you're supporting us as a charity and you're supporting local makers.
In those days, when I came here last year, they were actually selling these chairs.
Yeah, we do still sell these chairs downstairs. You can get 3 different variety of chair that MacIntosh designed for this building. The other thing, Magnus, I think before we go, we could maybe give a little bit of a scan across the carpet because we haven't talked that much. Whereas this building does have MacIntosh designed carpets. When I first started working here last year, I assumed that they'd been made up, that they were fake, but these are actually the carpet designs that MacIntosh made. And this is the first building that I've worked in that had a MacIntosh carpet design. So for me, it was quite unusual.
Of course, Glasgow's known for carpet production with Templeton's carpet factory as well,
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And again, on the carpet, you'll notice as we come in and come out that MacIntosh has designed a sort of catwalk structure. So again, he's controlling exactly where people stand, exactly how people move through the space.
So he's talking about the fluidity of his space as well. He's guiding people in. You're walking in. You're getting guided to where you are. It's his eye for detail has just been phenomenal. Of course, him and Margaret, and also Sister Frances and Herbert McNair as well. The 4, as we always refer to them.
Herbert being the baddie of the set.
Yeah. Just have a look at the back of these chairs as well. I mean, just look at the detail here.
You'll see again, we've got this kind of peacock feather or willow leaf cut out, and they're also put in pink insert around the base of the table, which often most people wouldn't really notice, right? But this is the kind of effort that MacIntosh goes. And then again, these glass enamel squares. As we move into the last building, we're going to see squares take over.
Okay.
Perfect. Brilliant. So coming up to the last public floor, the very top floor of the building has always been offices. It was offices in 1903, and it's our offices now. But this floor here is the home of the billiard room, a room for men. So it's actually really great to experience this room in darkness because it would have been a lot darker 120 years ago. Across the road now, we have buildings that are made of glass and metal, so they tend to reflect light into the building. But 120 years ago, the buildings across the road would have been stone, so you wouldn't have got so much light. Some people have said that MacIntosh designed the light to only come up to this point of the room, and the rest of the room is lit by these spotlights above the kind of settles and these 6 hanging lampshades here. So this room is the billiard room, or was the billiard room, and I'm going to just put this down here, Magnus, hopefully you can get that. This is a photograph from 120 years ago, and you will see that in the centre of the room is a MacIntosh designed billiard table. With the exception of the billiard table, pretty much everything in that photograph is still here today. The billiard room disappeared in the 20th century. MacIntosh went through a period of not being relevant or not being popular with people, and this billiard table, although it would have been very heavy, has somehow disappeared. What we have managed to keep, though, are these counterweights that are attached to the lights. So right up in the ceiling, you'll see these brass counterweights. MacIntosh designed these for the billiard table. 5 out of 6 of these are the original counterweights. They've lasted all this time. And Magnus, what I'm going to do now is demonstrate the lampshade coming down. So if you can follow me as we go, and you get a bit of an idea. So MacIntosh designed this light so that people using the billiard table can pull it all the way down here and get lots of lovely light on the billiard table. And then when we're ready, we can then lift it all the way back up again.
I am still trying to get one of these in my kitchen in 2023 and can't find it.
Yeah, this is very well. I mean, you could come and maybe get a 3D scan of this because these are designed exceptionally well. Often MacIntosh stuff, personal opinion, can be more style and less substance. You know, the buildings, because he's working with experimental materials, they don't always last that long. There's been a lot of trouble with kind of conservation of the buildings. The furniture is sometimes a bit rickety. It doesn't really stay together so well, but these have really lasted the test of time. And as I said, you probably saw in the lampshade, or you can see as we move around the space, if the camera can pick it up, that this room is where squares really come into play. MacIntosh loved what we call the generative power of the square, the fact that you can keep adding them on either side and getting these lovely grids. And we can see squares in these kind of settle chairs here, right at the back, perfect. And then, Magnus, if you scan up onto these kind of, yeah, perfect. So we follow just this along here, brilliant. So this is some of the only other stenciling in the building. But this is a willow tree hidden in the walls. And Magnus, you might have to step back to really take it in, but in the other space it's a bit more prominent. In this space it's slightly more pared down, maybe a bit more rational and masculine, if you like. This line goes all the way up like a tree trunk, and then coming back down we've got these pink stenciled squares like the leaves of a willow tree. So we still have willows lining this room. The rest of the room is in this very dark wood. That was actually quite common at the time, this kind of wooden panelled type billiard room. So that's not quite so remarkable, although in this real dark, you can kind of, for me, when I sit in here, I feel like this is where I feel like I'm in a castle, particularly in these kind of snug type spaces. They remind me of some other MacIntosh buildings where you've got a bit more of a kind of, just a little niche bit. And if you look at the windows, the way they're kind of like embedded inwards, and then we get these ones coming outwards, this is much more of a kind of castle type technique happening.
It kind of reminds me of the chapter rooms that used to get in old cathedrals as well, where the monks would sit in their chapter rooms. That's just my imagination.
No, I think that's also, I mean, that ties into this kind of romantic medievalism that I think particularly Margaret MacDonald would have been really into. So this room was for working men, but kind of men who would be working in blue-collar roles, or I guess in Glasgow, I think we describe it as the bonnets and the bowlers. The bonnets being more working-class people, and the bowlers being the sort of more white-collar work. So life changed for men in Victorian Glasgow just as it had changed for women. So as the city expanded to over 1 million people, men who'd previously worked and lived in the city had to move out of the city limits, and that meant that they couldn't go home for lunch in the same way that they had always done previously. And so what we got instead was a new type of lunch This has been written about a lot by Perilla Kinchin, who's written a lot of books on Cranston and on the Glasgow tea room phenomenon, particularly her book Tea and Taste. If you're interested, really, really worth it. She talks in there about a perpendicular lunch. So because men needed somewhere to eat, we opened up new dining halls, and they offered this thing called a perpendicular lunch, which is basically a lunch eaten standing up. You'd come into a room and it would have a great big table, a dining table covered in pies and pastries, sandwiches, things like that. The men could take what they want, a bit like a buffet, and then they would pay based on an honesty system as they left the building. Anyone who was found trying to cheat it was forced to make a donation to charity. Quite a sort of Victorian vibe. But also on that table would have been beer and claret and wine. And that is why it was a perpendicular lunch. It had to be.
When I worked in the corporate world, we used to have lunches at the Chamber of Commerce in George Square, where the Glasgow Chamber of Commerce is, and it was always the same fashion. I never knew that, but it's always perpendicular. You go in, you pick it up, and you're walking around, and you're mixing and mingling. Nobody would be sitting. They'll be mixing and mingling with others at these lunches at the Chamber of Commerce.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a business style, and it would be interesting. It's kind of chicken and egg type question, because the way it seems to have come into being, the perpendicular lunch, was that from the late 1700s onwards, the magistrates in Glasgow had already noticed that the city had a problem with alcohol. Mm-hmm. And so they made some guidance. It's not a law, it's not a rule, but they made some guidance that if you served alcohol in your venue, you didn't have seats. Because it meant that people would have a drink and then move on. They wouldn't sit around getting drunk all day in your establishment. And when you look at pictures, drawings or paintings of old pubs, people are normally standing up, right, rather than sitting down. But in this room, you'll notice that we have got seats. There are seats in this room. And the reason for that is, in all of Cranston's tea rooms, we didn't serve any alcohol.
Of course, yeah.
It's alcohol free. Cranston's family, I can't remember if we talked about it downstairs, but they were members of the temperance movement. All of the hotels that they ran were temperance hotels, which means in lay terms, they didn't serve alcohol. The temperance movement is actually a Glaswegian invention that went across the world. It started in the north of the city in about 1829. The temperance movement got people to sign certificates or pledges to say that they wouldn't drink alcohol anymore and to persuade them that their lives were going to be better without alcohol. And those designs of certificates, I've actually seen them in different parts of the world, but they're still the same certificates that were designed and printed in Glasgow and Britain. So that's another way that Glasgow contributed to the world's historical development.
So let's talk about, again, back to Rennie MacIntosh, because he himself, he didn't have, as you said, you mentioned earlier that he kind of went out of favour for a while, and he did go abroad. He moved into more of the watercolours. He moved away from the design and the architecture, more into the art. And then he went down to spend a lot of his time down in Port Vendôme in south of France on the Spanish border. But he did fall ill very, very young.
Yeah, unfortunately, despite his relationship or friendship with Cranston, who was a temperance leader, MacIntosh fell into drinking more and more heavily. He tried to get better. He also smoked. So in about 1913, MacIntosh and Margaret went to England. By that time, they'd had some problems in Glasgow. Some commissions had gone wrong. MacIntosh had broken off an engagement with his boss's sister. Like, they'd become more and more isolated. So they went to England, and then the First World War broke out, and for some reason that meant they couldn't get back across the border. So they ended up staying in Sussex for a bit.
Oh, he was actually arrested because he was arrested as a spy.
Yeah.
Or accused of being a spy.
He was accused of being a spy because basically, I'm English, so I can say this. English people think that when Scottish people speak, they actually sound like German spies. So he was also walking up and down the coastline with a lantern in the middle of the night. So there was reports that he was doing some spying, which he wasn't. Then they moved to London, and the commissions just weren't coming. They were doing some design work. They couldn't get any more buildings after that. And then, as you say, they moved to France. MacIntosh was smoking and drinking, and he died in, just after, well, about 60 years. He was 60 years old, so he died in 1928.
Yeah, and just a lot of the stuff, I mean, so he kind of was forgotten about for a while, shall we say. I mean, there were, his legacy was here, but it wasn't really, as I'm aware, until about the 1980s, when they had another great exhibition here in Glasgow, which kind of transformed the whole city, and it was the Garden Festival, and suddenly there was this MacIntosh revival.
Yeah, so there'd been an undercurrent. Actually, this year is the 50th anniversary of the Charles Rennie MacIntosh Society. So that takes us back to 1973. My understanding of it was that as they modernised the city, brought down or levelled what were called the slums, and built new motorways, there was one motorway in particular that was supposed to be going through the site of a very early MacIntosh design called the Martyrs School. And there were kind of protest groups about that, and that gave birth to the MacIntosh Society, so people starting to appreciate it. There had been people in between that period, from the 20s to the 60s and 70s, that had appreciated. So Sir Hugh Fraser, who is most well known for owning a chain of shops called House of Fraser, he was on the board of directors of this building when it was a department store, and he rescued the original fireplace from this room. So the fireplace was going to be smashed up by the department store. They didn't want a fireplace in here. They were going to use this as an office. So he was very worried about it. So he snuck into the building very late at night with a team of builders, and they took this fireplace apart piece by piece. And Magnus, you could maybe just, if you have a look at just this fireplace here. So they took this apart piece by piece. They donated it to the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, where it still lives in their ironwork collection. The next day, when Sir Hugh Fraser came into the building, he learned that the department store had changed their mind. They were never going to get rid of it in the first place, but he'd already replaced it with this replica.
Okay.
So there were people fighting for MacIntosh, but there was definitely a real lull period.
I think we'll probably be looking at winding up in a few minutes, but you know, it's just really been great, Oliver. Thank you very much. This has been a fabulous tour.
I could go on I could listen to you forever.
But you've got to come, folks, if you haven't already been here, and take this tour, and also come and sample the delights of having tea and scones and whatever else, you know, here. But I'll just let you wrap up again.
A great big thank you to Oliver here for being a fantastic tour guide here. Absolutely wonderful taking it. I mean, we're so honoured to be invited in here and to collaborate with you on this. And hopefully our audience across the world will really enjoy this as well. So they know when you come to Glasgow, definitely come to this place in Sauchiehall Street. You're going to love it. It's called the
MacIntosh at the Willow.
Great space to come into, absolutely wonderful. But I wonder if Mike could just take the camera for a second, because I want to do another thank you here.
Oh yeah, we've got to get our cameraman.
Yeah, we've got to get our cameraman in, so when there's Magnus, come over here.
Yeah.
So this has been our cameraman for today. Say hi, Magnus.
Hiya.
So he's done very well. Carrying the camera for an hour and a half, it's not easy, is it?
Yes.
Oh, you think it is? Okay. So a big thank you to everybody for the collaboration. So thanks, Magnus. Thanks, Oliver.